So tonight we're going to talk about collimation. This is the thing that you get used to it eventually. If you've spent $1,000 on a telescope and then you realize every time you set up, you have to collimate your telescope because you bought a Newtonian. It's just, it's something you get used to. But if you paid $300 for your telescope and every time you set it up, you have to collimate it, you don't want to get used to it. You want to basically get rid of that thing and go buy yourself something. If I spend more money, but buy the same kind of telescope, will the collimation problem go away? And the answer is no. You got to spend money on a different kind of telescope, not a different kind of mount, different kind of telescope. So that's what we're basically going to cover. And I just talked about this. We'll talk about what is collimation, why you have things like finders and piggyback scopes that need to be collimated, knowing when your collimation is off and how to do something about it, what the adjustment screws are there telescopes that don't require collimation? How about are there telescopes that require less collimation? And then if you're into buying reflectors, there's a thing called secondary mirror obstruction that you probably need to be aware of. And then if collimation is that hard, are there tools that I can buy that will make it easier? And you'll realize, yes, there is, but if there's a certain kind of telescope that you've bought, you may not be able to use those tools. So here's the basics of collimation. The light comes in, the light bounces around, and it eventually makes it out to your eye or to your camera. And collimation is nothing more than adjusting the reflective parts of the light path so that they all align up to deliver the maximum possible light to the next reflecting stage in the process. So the light, this is a Newtonian. The light comes in from the front, bounces off the primary mirror in the back, bounces up to the secondary mirror, and then off of the secondary mirror out to your eyepiece or camera. And you'll notice that the primary mirror is curved. That means it's going to focus the light down into a cone shape. It's not going to be a column of light anymore like it was coming in. It's going to be cone shaped. And if you get that cone at just the right angle and just the right up and down distance, you can get the light right on the center of your secondary and at the right distance so that the most possible light bounces off your secondary and goes out to your eyepiece or to your eye or your camera. And now it is at sharp focus. It does come down to a cone. So it's like you're bending the top off the cone to go out the side. So that's all collimation is if you've got multiple reflective surfaces on the inside of your telescope, it's just making sure the most possible light makes it out. So here's something to think about regarding collimation. Collimation is a lot like hand crank starting an automobile. Sure, you could do it, and people did it for a while, but they got tired of the frustration, the personal injury threat, the fact that it sometimes took a few times, wasn't always reliable, and they said, is there a better way of doing this? They didn't make cars go away. They just changed the design of the car so it had a starter and a battery, and you could turn the key or push the starter button, and the starter would rotate around until the fuel went into the carburetor, into the engine, these cylinders, and it would start the car, and you were happy because you didn't have to crank that damn crank on the front of the car anymore. And then it got even better. That starter costs money. Now that you have computerized fuel injection, how about we just change the timing of the spark plugs because we know where the cylinders are in the cylinder, and we just, whatever cylinder happens to be closest to fully compressed will ignite that cylinder. And that'll give the engine a little bit of rotation. And if we set that timing just right, we can go from the engine not rotating to the engine rotating at full speed with just a couple of sparks in the right place. Kick, 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 kick. And now the engine's running. And once the engine's running, you're great. Don't need a starter motor. So if you've ever bought or rented a car where you pull up to a traffic light and the engine shuts off, and then as you step on the gas to leave the traffic light, the engine comes back on. That car has no starter. That car has electronic ignition timing and fuel injection, electronic fuel injection, and it's literally to give you better gas mileage. It shuts off the car, and then when you step on the gas, it realizes you push the pedal, and it adjusts the timing and starts the engine again, and the engine is rotating back to full speed in less than a second. So when you find a better way to do things, why continue doing it the way that's not as good, more frustrating, difficult, hazardous, cost more? Yeah. So the hand crank of amateur telescopes is Newtonian reflectors. So there are other forms of collimation. This is not, people refer to this as collimation, but it's not really collimation, it's collinear alignment. This is making your finder point in the same direction as your magnified telescope. So that's making the finder line up where the telescope is pointing. And if you have two telescopes, either a piggyback, one on top of the other, or side saddle, two telescopes side by side on the same mount, you need them pointing in the right place, which is the same place. The best way to do that is in the daytime, because if you do it in the daytime, you can see what you're pointing at. You can pick something that's a mile away, and that's good enough. So even if you have a telescope that doesn't require collimation, your finder, or if you have a secondary telescope, may require collinear alignment, which people just refer to as collimation. So how do you know when it's collimation is off? You point it at a bright star, you defocus it, and if the star has little spikies coming out of it, and when you defocus it, if it has concentric light rings and the rings aren't all in the center, then you probably need to touch up your collimation. Or if you don't have the bright star defocused, if you're trying to bring it to focus and it just won't come to focus, that's probably because your primary mirror and your secondary mirror don't have the right distance between them, and that light cone that gets bent out the side is beyond where the eyepiece is, or is ahead of where the eyepiece is. The light cone's not going far enough. So you need collimation. So is collimation something I need to do? Well, if you own a Newtonian style reflector, also known as a Dobsonian, that's just a difference in the mount, it's still a Newtonian telescope, they're going to require frequent collimation. Like the mirrors aren't that heavily mounted. The secondary is just on this spider sitting out in the middle in kind of free air. The primary mirror is in basically a plastic lined sling, and it doesn't have a lot of stiffness in it. So when you toss that into your vehicle and the vehicle goes over a few bumpy roads to get out to your dark rural site, the telescope's been bounced around enough where it's going to be out of collimation. So to collimate it, depending upon how it's off, you'll have to either adjust the primary mirror or the secondary mirror or the rotation of the secondary mirror, and then you'll get it back into alignment. Something people don't pay attention to is when you think you've got that primary mirror perfect, and then you go to lock it down, you go to turn the set screws to lock it down, that'll actually move the primary mirror. So it'll actually go out of collimation because you want to lock it down tightly to avoid having to collimate it again. You may be lucky enough that you didn't bounce it too much and you took it out to a site, you set it up again, and you check the collimation, it's still good. Consider yourself lucky. I just mentioned all the screws and the fact that it's not just the tilting, it's also the distance, the rotation of your secondary. You have to get all that lined up to be able to see clearly. So are there any telescopes that don't require collimation at all? Well, there is no telescope that requires no collimation ever. But there are telescopes that get collimated at the factory, and unless you go messing with it, you don't have to change the collimation for the life of the telescope. That would be refractors. They will set the optical alignment at the factory and then lock it in with rings they tighten on the front and back of the optical lenses, and they have little spacers between the lens elements, so they can press it in and it's locked into the factory. You're good to go. If you ever like disassemble the lenses, yeah, you're going to need to do some serious collimation on it. So this is why the serious amateur astrophotographers use triplet lens refractors, is because you never have to worry about collimation. You can set the back end focus once. You actually buy fixed length adapters and they're good. But if you mount a secondary camera on there for your guiding, now you've got to get both of them collinear collimated. So there's a little bit of collimation you still have to do. So there are telescopes that require less frequent collimation, and they're still reflectors, but instead of being a Newtonian style reflector, they have heavier primary mirrors and they have corrector plates on the front. And there's two basic classes of them. There are the Schmidt-Cassegrains, which have a Schmidt-style corrector plate on the front and a spherical mirror at the back. So once you get those locked in, because the secondary is on a glass plate, it kind of stays in place and it's circular, so you don't have to worry about rotation. And the primary is heavy mass, so it's not going to move around all that much. So it lasts pretty good a long time. They might have to touch it up every couple of years. But the ones that you rarely, if ever, have to adjust the collimation on are Maksutov Cassegrains and Rumakov Cassegrains, because a Maksutov Cassegrain, the secondary is literally a circular reflective spot painted on the back side of the corrector. No secondary movement whatsoever. And the primary is also spherical, but the secondary is convex in shape. So getting it directly centered is a little tougher to do, but once you get it in, it's probably good for a few years. But the sweet spot, so to speak, is the Rumakov or the Rumek Cassegrains. Those, the secondary mirror is concave, as opposed to what this diagram shows you, is concave and it's glued on. And the primary mirror is a parabola. So it's much easier at the factory to get all that optical alignment just done. Lock it all down, glue on the secondary. I've had Rumakovs that I've had for 8 years, never ever adjusted the collimation on them. So if you want an amateur telescope that gives you high magnification and never have to worry about collimation, get yourself a Rumakov Cassegrain. That's a Cassegrain with a true secondary mirror glued on to the corrector plate on the front, and a parabolic mirror, not a spherical mirror. So now we talk about secondary mirror obstruction. And you don't notice this at night because the sky's dark. If you're doing imaging, you might notice it because the light in the center of the field of view is a little dimmer. Basically, the stars look a little dimmer than they are in the rest of the field of view because the light comes in around the secondary. In the case of a Newtonian, the secondary mirror is elliptical in shape typically, which creates a larger secondary obstruction. In the case of a Schmidt-Cassegrain, it's smaller and it's round, so there's a little less secondary obstruction. In the case of a Maksutov Cassegrain, where the mirror is reflective spot on the back, it's actually an oversized reflective spot because it's hard to get it right in the center. So you want to get more of the field of view to get the light out. So the spot is actually bigger than a Rumakov's true secondary mirror. So if you want to minimize the secondary mirror obstruction, go with the Rumakov. Collimation tools. If you buy an inexpensive reflector like a Newtonian or Dobsonian, you get one of these little things that looks like a flat eye cap that goes where the eyepiece goes, and it's got a little round hole in the center. So if you point it at a bright star, point your telescope at a bright star, and you try and bring it to focus, you'll get the maximum amount of light coming out the center. And if your mirror is a little off, you'll get more light if you point the mirror towards the center. But it's deceptive, because if the mirror is in the right direction but at the wrong distance, it'll be a brighter dot or a dimmer dot. And the variance in bright and dim can be the difference between it being in focus in the field of view or being slightly out of focus. But you won't see that with one of those. So next up is you spend probably under $50, and you buy what is known as a Cheshire. This is a fancy way of saying it's got a graded glass in the center of what looks like an eyepiece, and there's a hole in the center of it. And you will direct an in-focus bright star onto this gridded reflector, and you'll direct the light into the hole. So you can see when the light beam is over on the gridded glass, is it a large spot of light or a small spot of light? You're going for the smallest possible spot of light, and then you steer the spot of light into the hole. The hole is a little bit oversized, so it's not precisely where you're going to come to focus, but it's close. So that's your under $50 collimation tool, is a Cheshire. But you can get the laser equivalent of it that will give you an even tighter alignment. It's a laser collimator, and those go for, let's just say, under $100, typically around $70. And it's got a red dot laser where your eye would be, and that shines down through the center of the hole, out to the reflector, and then back off the reflector onto the gridded glass that has a bullseye on it, which is just a fancy way of saying it makes it easier to line it up. And you do the same sort of thing you do with the Cheshire. It's just like a laser-assisted Cheshire. And you line up the laser, you make the laser red dot as small as possible, you bring it to the center until it disappears in the black hole. You'll notice that the black hole is just a touch smaller than it is on the optical Cheshire. And then if you got about $300, you can buy a fancy laser. And people that have spent a lot of money on their Newtonian, so if you've gone out and spent $700 to $1,200 on a Astro grade Newtonian, you're going to go spend $300 on your Astro Newtonian grade collimation tool. This will actually throw down a red grid on your primary mirror. And you want the grid to be a nice square pattern. So that gets your mirror at the right distance and all the tilt on your primary. Now, your secondary doesn't really do much for your secondary. That's why they also come with a laser Cheshire, because you do your primary with the gridded laser, you do your secondary with the laser Cheshire. And then if you really want to get it down fine, they give you kind of an eye cap thing that's big, expensive, made out of aluminum. Think about it this way. If collimation is such a serious thing that they give you the little eye cap collimation tool with every Newtonian. So it's kind of like you can't make the telescope operate properly without it. But if you're willing to buy a little optical Cheshire, you can get pretty much along the way, unless you're doing astrophotography. If you're doing astrophotography, you probably want to spend your $70 or $80 and get yourself a laser collimation tool. And that'll work great. But if you really spend a lot of money on your Newtonian reflector, then you got to go for the $300 gridded laser. Ask yourself the question, if I know I can buy a telescope that doesn't require collimation at all, like what the professionals use, which is a refractor, or I can buy a telescope that rarely, if ever, requires collimation, like a Ruhmkorff, variant of a Maksutov Cassegrain, why buy the car with a starter crank? And here's the obstruction to easy collimation. There is a type of a Newtonian reflector telescope called a Brid-Jones or a Jones bird. Depends upon whose name comes first. I just take it alphabetically. A Brid-Jones is a Newtonian reflector telescope, but instead of having a parabolic primary mirror, it has a cheaper to produce spherical primary mirror. But that won't make the problem of short focal length f4 focal ratio go away. So what they do is they either glue in or screw in to the bottom of the draw tube that you use for focusing an additional 2-element lens that's kind of like a built-in Barlow. You can still use the little eyepiece cap as your collimation tool. But if you attempt to use a laser collimation tool, this secondary doublet Barlow lens will distort the laser on its way back to the eyepiece. So it essentially, if you think of it as if the light coming into the telescope needs to be condensed to take it from an f4 to an f8, then if you're originating light from the laser at the eyepiece, it's going to spread the light out. And now when it comes back, you can't bring it to a nice small dot. So what I've always taught people is, if you have a laser collimation tool and you want to make your Brid-Jones into a Newtonian that you can collimate on a regular basis, take the damn Brid-Jones lens out, go get yourself a Barlow, call it a day. Same effect. You'll take your f4, make it an f8, because a Barlow is a doublet lens. So this is essentially a Barlow, but it's built in. But that way you can take the $200 Newtonian and make it a $300 Brid-Jones, and instead of having an f4 focal ratio, you have an f8, which makes everything bigger. So it's human eyeball to eyepiece more pleasing. Who's the biggest perpetrator of this fraud of a telescope? Celestron. So whenever I see the Power Seeker brand, it's like, no, just don't buy that. Yeah, but it's only $300. Yeah, but it's still on this crappy, floppy equatorial mount, and it's still got a Brid-Jones element in there, which means it's going to be hard to collimate. But because it's a Newtonian reflector, you're always going to have to collimate it. Just say no, run screaming. So in conclusion, yeah, some scopes are going to have to be collimated. If it's a Newtonian, it's going to have to be collimated. If it's a Schmidt-Cassegrain, they're collimated at the factory, and unless you bounce them around a lot, they're probably going to be collimated for a number of years. They're not that difficult to collimate. So if you want a scope that's never going to need collimation, go get yourself a refractor. If you want one that gets collimated at the factory and probably never needs to be collimated ever again, either a Maksutov Cassegrain or a Rumikov Cassegrain, and you'll be happy with that. Steer clear of the Brid-Jones. Anytime you have an instrument or a tool that requires you to pay more money to buy tools to make the tool easier to use, maybe you bought the wrong tool to begin with. Of course, that's just my opinion. I've got 8 telescopes.
Well, I have a Maksutov Cassegrain, and rarely needs collimation, but it does need collimation eventually, especially if you keep in a hot car always.
You bounce it around in the car for a few years, you'll need to touch it up. But it's not that
But
difficult to do.
it's been like 5 years, and the last time I collimate is shoe holding. And you cannot use a laser tool to collimate a Maksutov Cassegrain. It's very difficult to do it. Some people have techniques because they are used to do it, like every time they do astrophotography, especially planetary or even deep sky. If they use a Maksutov Cassegrain, they have to often do the collimation if they do astrophotography, but it's just observation. A collimation lasts for 5 years. Only if you are astrophotographer, then you need to do often. And there is a technique that you put out of focus. You see the have refraction rings, and you try to centralize. Some people have like a technique for a pencil. They use a pencil as a shadow and mark the rings to see if the rings are equal in the shadow of the rings. So that is techniques to do it, but there is no laser collimation for Maksutov Schmidt-Cassegrain.
For a Schmidt-Cassegrain, and you don't need them for a Maksutov or a Rumikov. When I used to use my LX200 Schmidt-Cassegrain, and I had to collimate it, and every couple of years I'd have to collimate it. Don't bounce it around too much. I would take a camera, put it in where the eyepiece goes. I would then connect up the camera to an LCD projector, and I would put a giant white sheet on my garage door outside my house, and I would defocus a star so it would create the image of concentric rings. And I could, from 20 feet away, see whether it was in tight collimation or not, because that little tiny group of concentric rings was now 8 feet across. I tried to do that with Helen's scope at Fox Observatory once, and I couldn't bring the camera to focus. So we call it.
But then
Charles or Fernando, I forget which.
no, it was Fernando. Fernando brought to his house, and he uses his garage. It's a tiny little dot fake star in the garage, and then he
it's
uses
an artificial
the pencil.
star.
Yeah, and he uses the technique of a pencil,
Yep.
and he's so because he has the same kind of telescope that as I do, just 8-inch, mine is 5-inch. So because the way he does it is so often, because he does planetary and moon pictures, he knows how to move like exactly. So he did so good of a collimation that this collimation with the telescope inside the car all the time, it's just perfect. He did an excellent collimation. It's lasting for 5 years.
So you remember at the front of this presentation where I talked about when you're out of collimation and this is what you see, here's what you have to adjust, be it mirror tilt, primary tilt, secondary rotation, primary in out, secondary in out. So Fernando has a lot of experience doing this. So when he sees that your scope is out of collimation, he knows exactly which screw to go to.
Yes.
It's just that experience.
Especially because it's the same exactly kind of telescope. The
Cassegrains.
Yeah, it's the Schmidt-Cassegrain Celestrum, but the last batch that was made in California.
Yeah.
So we have exactly the same telescope, just his is 8-inch and mine is 5-inch. So he knows like just twinkle the screws in the right place and yeah. And he does it so often that he changed the screws of his secondary to be like a dial with the hand. Mine used to have to use the little screw because mine I think was metric, and they could not find the Bob's knobs for the size of my telescope. They didn't have it.
Yeah. What I did, even though I was using a projection screen to make the concentric circles very large, I found that my hand would get in the way of the telescope when I was adjusting the little screws on the front. And rather than buying Bob's knobs, I bought a very long hex wrench. You think of a hex wrench?
The L, yeah.
One side short, one side's long.
Uh-huh.
You can buy them with really long sides. So when I bought,
so you don't even need the pencil. Your screw is the pencil.
Yeah. My Allen wrench was long enough that I could actually put it in the screw, and then my hand would be out of the field of light.
Perfect.
I could, and also because I was so far away, I could adjust it a few degrees, and I would get a turn. There was a fraction number of degrees of the actual rotation. So when you have that long lever movement, you're way out here moving it. You might be moving it like 3 to 5 degrees, but the actual rotation is like 1/10 of a degree.
Yes, very precise motion.
Yeah.
And then you had it blown out, and it's like tiny little bit of motion. You can see where it's going and how you do it. Yeah.
And that's why I was so happy when not only did I get a Maksutov Cassegrain, I got Rumakovs, and then I just stuck with those throughout. So
no collimation for you.
I've had a couple of those now for over 8 years. Never, ever have I collimated them. I don't even touch the screws because I just don't have a need to.
Yeah. The other cool thing that is related, so when I was on my flight on Sophia, my first flight, my first mission, they lost the first hour because the instrument wasn't matching with the telescope. So they had to collimate the instrument, put the instrument in the right position because they were having problems with the position. And then as they were commenting that the instrument is not pointing to the borehole, And I'm like, what are you talking about? Why don't you say collimation? And it's like, you know what? We should use the word because they got used to, let's say they got used to use like technical old guys technique of a language inside NASA. Probably the people who, you know, had to get to change to metric kicking and screaming. And then they have like specific expressions that they use on Sophia that were like, you know, that's just a local vernacular that they only use here because nobody else has used this.
No,
And then
no,
when
no.
I said it, like,
There
oh,
are.
so you're collimating, and they go like, we should use the word.
Yeah, they were mechanical engineers, because in mechanical engineering, not including astronomy, just mechanical engineering, when you want to line things up, they use terms like borehole and bore site.
Yes, that's what they were saying. Like,
Right. And that's what they're used to. But an astronomer would use collimation and would never talk about boreholes and bore sites.
no.
Yeah.
And then they were like, come on, you're like doing your doctorate degree, third dissertation, you're saying borehole. It's
Oh,
it's
no, no. Remember, we learned that professional astronomers should not be thought of as all-seeing and all-knowing of astronomy and telescopes. They know far more about stellar evolution and galactic arm movement than we'll ever know. But as to like, what's a telescope?
How a
and they
telescope
operate,
works?
but no.
Yeah. Only for pictures.
Yeah. And they get those via email.
Yes.
Okay. So that's all
Any
I have for the
questions?
presentation.
Very nice. Thank you.
Okay. So like I said, next week we'll talk about dispelling myths involving low-end first-use telescope, novice or newbie telescopes. And then the following week we'll talk about what might be a good new telescope to buy if you've never owned one before. The best one is go pay your admission fee and go look through a big observatory telescope. And barring that, go buy yourself a nice pair of binoculars.
Yes.
And then if you really want to, don't buy a telescope that costs, let's say, under $500.
No.
Because if you buy it in the $300, $200, or $100 price,
Expensive
you
toy.
are not going to be satisfied.
No, it's an expensive, crappy toy.
Yes. Save your
I've seen
pennies.
like people frustrated that I took like, I wanted help. And I just took the time. And when that happens, we are always glad that it's the moon or the sun or something large for you to put in the eyepiece to save grace. And like you teach them to collimate the eyepiece or the telescope with the finder. And then you teach them how to do that. And then you put the eyepiece. And then when you finally go and look at the eyepiece, and when you do this, the whole flimsy thing moves, and there is nothing else there. And the eyepiece is like so small that you can barely see because they want lots of magnification. So it's very frustrating. So normally what I did, I like, when did you buy this? Can you return it? Because that is not a good telescope. But then I try to kind of conversate, not to offend, and figure out if it was recent or somebody gave to them. Because you don't look at the teeth of a given horse. You know, it's a gift. So, but it was so frustrating. And then you could see that only the parents could figure out how to make it work. And the kids got frustrated. So when you buy a crappy telescope, you make a machine for children to hate science. It is a risk because they're going to get frustrated and not going to see anything. Probably the last image they're going to see in that telescope is the image that I'm showing, because I worked like at least 1 hour to make the crappy telescope to work and point to the moon. And they will, I get home. All the collimation is lost. Everything is lost. They try to set up in their house. They won't be able to see anything. So the kids are going to get frustrated and hate astronomy forever. So that's like a pair of binoculars, or maybe a refractor in an out azimuth tripod, or nice cheaper telescope like $300 or so. And if you don't have $300, it's better a pair of binoculars.
Or visit your local observatory.
Yeah.
Yeah. Whenever somebody would come up to Fox Observatory with a, as the colloquial term is, POS telescope, piece of crap telescope, they would always go, "Hey, Monroe, you can help them with this. You know all about those." And I would spend the better part of an hour. I would get them to the point where they could see the moon, or if it was good enough, see Saturn or Jupiter. And I know they were never going to be able to duplicate that themselves. But I would spend the better part of an hour, and I would get it to the point where they could see something through their telescope, and they were just so happy.
Yeah.
But the moment you told them, this is an equatorial mount, every time you use it, you're going to have to line up this axis with where the North Star is. And if you can't see the North Star, you're not going to be properly aligned. So if there's trees, buildings, or whatever in the way, or you don't know where the North Star is or how to find it, I can tell you how to find it, but if it's blocked, you're not going to be able to properly line up this telescope. And you hear them say things like, "I have to do that every time I use it." I said, "Yeah, that's why."
Yeah, so
first set it
return
up,
the damn thing.
yeah, I said, that's why when you first set it up, there were certain parts of the sky you couldn't point it to because the gears only move in a certain rotational direction. And if you're not properly lined up, you can't get there from here.
Yeah.
But the absolute bottom was the two older women that showed up with one of those rickety Newtonians, and they said they spent 50 cents on the telescope at a garage sale, and they just want to see if they can see anything through it. I showed them the moon, Saturn, and Jupiter in about a 2-hour session of getting it to work and educating them and telling them what they were looking at. And obviously they never got it to work again, but they were very happy. They both became members of SFAA that night. So we made $40 off the deal, and that was it. So yeah, it is worthwhile to help people understand. But the saddest ones were when they would spend over $1,000 on something that you just
I got like one parent one time that he got like telescopes on sale, like the crappy telescope he started, but he bought two, one for each kid so they don't fight.
Yeah.
And
now I was referring to the what they call the Light Sense by Celestron. It comes with a GPS, and it comes with a camera, and it comes with a crappy Newtonian telescope. But it's on a decent, it's not on a high end, but it's on a decent equatorial mount. So you had to line it up, but you constantly were fighting what the telescope was seeing on its plate solving with the camera versus what the GPS was saying is your current location. And the end result was, I said, I'll tell you what, let's try disconnecting the GPS and disconnecting the camera, and then telling the telescope it doesn't have a GPS and it doesn't have a light sense camera, and see if we can get it to work old school. And we did. We got it to work old school. And he felt very burned by the fact that he spent extra money for it to be automated and frustration free, which is what Celestron was quoting it as. And it was neither. It was an excess of money he had to spend, and it was not frustration free. But I mean, they are even selling computerized go-to mounts now that are altitude azimuth, and they don't come with a hand pedal. Oh, you just use the app on your phone, and the app is crap, and it's not reliable, and the connection's flaky, and you're going to get
up the battery of the telescope and the phone.
Yeah, it puts out its own Wi-Fi network. So if you have two people with the same brand telescope, at a star party event. It's like, how do you know one from the other?
Yeah, and then it's like the service we do is because we'd be in a line teaching someone to use the telescope for the first time. And you could see the disappointment in the eyes of kids. So it is a public service, and maybe future genius somewhere that they won't be frustrated with astronomy if we teach them to buy the correct first telescope.
Okay, so that's all for tonight's presentation. I told you it wasn't going to be that long. Turned out to be longer than I thought.
Yes.
As it always is the case. So any comments or anything before I stop recording?
Well,
So,
thank you very much.
Stop
As usual,
sharing.
it's wonderful to see you all.
And anything else to talk about? I'll stop recording here. Let me